Okay, in this line, at the end, what is SPN, shortest process next algorithm? How we select the process?
The shortest process next is the next program that you would choose for execution will be the one which takes the shortest amount of time to execute.
Okay, so
that you expect to take the lead.
That's right. That's right. So as he mentioned, shortest process next SPN algorithm select the process with the shortest service time. That is expected time is because we cannot predict the future. Okay. How about the other shortest remaining time algorithm? So shortest remaining time means expected service time minus actual execution time, right? So instead of just the service time, they give priority to a process with the shortest remaining time, right? Remaining time. Okay. Okay. So SRT and SPN. Okay, let me ask you SPN. Is starvation possible in SPN? Shortest process next.
Yes.
Yes. Why? Is this preemptive policy or non-preemptive policy? You can read. Hold on.
It's non-preemptive.
Non-preemptive policy. Why starvation is possible in SPN scheduling? Why starvation is possible in SPN?
Starvation. Because when starvation occurs, two process or more process wait for the other, and but in SPN, a short process will jump to the head of the queue. So if they wait for each other, they will keep on waiting if they are all short.
I think you know. So in SPN, so it's called SPN, but in general, in other textbooks, it's called SJF, shortest just first algorithm. So if there is already queue and this is a non-preemptive policy, but if there is a new process with shortest expected service time, it keep coming, then they will select this new process, and the long process should wait in the queue indefinitely. That can cause starvation problem. Okay, that's one of the issues. So how about shortest remaining time? Is starvation possible?
Yes.
Yes. Why?
It's similar with SPN. SPN.
That's right, like SPN.
Yeah. Because shorter processes are coming continuously. The remaining processes with longer service time can't have the priority.
I think you know. So the same region applies to this SRT, right? So even though this is a preemptive version of SPN, so they look at remaining time instead of entire service time. If there are new process coming in and their expected service time is smaller than the remaining time of the process in the queue, then they still have to serve the new process, which means the longer process should wait in the queue indefinitely. That can cause starvation. Okay, so both preemptive and non-preemptive version of this SPN and SRT can cause starvation. And so to avoid starvation, we have to consider the waiting time of the process. If some process is waiting in the queue more and more, then we should give some favor to this process, right? So that means we should consider the aging of process. If the process is waiting in the queue for some longer time, then we should give some priority to that process to avoid starvation. So this highest response ratio next is non-preemptive policy, but it can avoid starvation problem. So when the current process completes, or if it's blocked because of I/O, so this means it's non-preemptive policy. It waits until its completion or asking for I/O, right? That means it's non-preemptive version. But it chooses the next process with the highest response ratio. So response ratio here is the normalized turnaround time. So what is normalized turnaround time? Normalized turnaround time is time spent waiting time plus service time divided by service time. Okay, that's the this response ratio. So let's look at the example. This is the example we have discussed in the previous lecture. So the first process arrived at time 0. There is no other process. And this should have the highest response ratio because there is only one process. So this gets assigned CPU and it runs to completion because this is a non-preemptive policy. So at time 3, B has arrived at time 2 and there is no other process. Okay? So time 2 is assigned CPU and it's run to completion. So it runs 6 time units, and then at time 9, C and D should have arrived. C arrived at 4 and D arrived at 8, if you remember, because we spent enough time last lecture. I think you remember these times, right? Okay, so they are arriving at 0, 2, 4, 6, 8 and multiple of 2, and these are the service time. So here we are looking at process C and process D. Process C should have arrived here and D should arrive here. So 4, 6 and 8. So there are CDE. We have to choose among CDE. So which one should we choose? Highest normalized response time. So let's calculate normalized response time for each process. So and here C has arrived at 4 and this is time 9. So it's been waiting for 5 time units and its service time is 4. So normalized turnaround time is 5 plus 4 divided by 4, which is how much? 9 divided by 4? 2.25. How about D? D has arrived at time 6 and this is time 9. So their waiting time is 3 and service time is 5. 3 plus 5 divided by 5. So 8 over 5, that's 1.6. Okay? How about E? E arrived at 8. So it's been waiting for 1 time unit and its service time is 2. So 1 plus 2 divided by 2, which is 1.5. So 1.5, 1.6, 2.25. So according to highest response ratio, this wins the competition. Okay, it runs to completion and complete. At time 9 and 4, this is 13. Okay, and there are 2 remaining processes, and we need to compute this response ratio again. And she has been waiting she has arrived. We have completed the C. So D has arrived at 6, right? And this is 13. So waiting time is 7, its service time is 5. 7 plus 5 divided by 5. Is that right? Right. So 12 over 5, which is 2.4. And this one arrived at 8, and it has been waiting for 5, right? And its service time is 2. So 5 plus 2 divided by 2, which is 3.5. Okay? So we should choose E. And then finally T runs to completion. Okay? So because it's considering the aging of process, eventually the longer process will get scheduled and there is no starvation problem. So why shorter jobs are favored? Aging without service increase the ratio so that the long process will eventually win the competition against shorter jobs. That's the highest response ratio next algorithm. Okay? The next one is called feedback scheduling, and it's also called multi-level feedback queue. The motivation for this feedback scheduling is three scheduling algorithms that we have discussed recently, which is SPN, shortest process next, and SRT, shortest remaining time, and HRRN, highest response ratio next, or actually considers the expected service time, which is the future. Okay? We can only approximate. So we have a look at how we can approximate based on the recent history. Okay? We can give average ratio of last and execution, or we can use more weight to the recent execution time. Then we can estimate its future expected service time. But in general, we cannot predict the future correctly. We can only look at the history or the past. Okay? So instead of looking at the future, let's look at the past execution. And it penalizes jobs that have been running longer by placing this job into lower priority queues. So in feedback scheduling, there are multiple levels of queues. And this one is the highest priority queue, and this is second highest priority queue, and this one is the lowest priority queue. So after it's been running, when it comes back, it doesn't go back to the original queue, it goes back to the lower priority queue, and so on. So eventually, the shorter jobs will finish completely in these queue, but long jobs will go down and down and eventually stay in this low priority queue. So when a process enters the system, it is first placed into the highest priority queue, ready queue 0. But after its first preemption, they can apply round robin algorithm. After its first preemption, it's demoted to next lower priority queue, and so on. So short process will complete quickly, while long process may be demoted again and again. And if there are processes remaining, and then these process in this lowest priority queue may have some starvation issues. Okay?
I was meaning to ask if it's infinite amount of queues, but I see in the end that it just goes around.
What do you mean by infinite amount of queues?
Yeah, I was wondering, is it infinite amount of queues? If you have a process that is infinite long, is it going to be infinite amount of queues?
So there are, so this is, I mean, in an actual system, all the resources are finite. So there should be a finite number of queues. Okay, so eventually this long process will stay in the lowest priority queue, which is not done infinite. Okay, so they may have some starvation issues. So to avoid starvation and to reduce this long turnaround time, one technique is when we can assign 2 to the power of I time unit for each lower priority queue. So even though it's demoted, when it's demoted, it's assigned more time so they can complete. But it still have some issues of starvation, right? Because finite number. You cannot have too much time. So eventually, maybe a process with long service time will stuck to the lowest priority queue, even though they get assigned more time for execution, right? So this is called feedback scheduling, but the advantage is you don't have to predict the future. You don't have to compute the expected service time. So based on the history, if you have been serviced for long, then you will be promoted to a lower priority queue. And eventually you will be placed into a lowest priority queue if you ask too much CPU time. Okay, that's fair. Okay, but the process with a short service time will complete quickly in the higher priority queues. And this is called feedback scheduling or multi-level feedback queue. Okay, so this is the example. This is example of this is time quantum. So they apply round robin algorithm, and this applies single time quantum for each level of each priority queue. And this is they can apply 2 of I to the power of I. They assign more time to lower priority queue to avoid starvation problem. Let's look at the example. Okay, at time 0 there is only A, process A, so they get assigned one time unit and then round robin, but there is no other process. So process A will get assigned another time unit for the next round, and then new process B is coming, so A is coming back to the queue. So in this case, they go back to the maybe ready queue of 1 after it's been serviced. And then this B is assigned CPU, and there is no other process to run, so A get assigned CPU again, and then C has arrived, okay, and then B and A runs to completion, okay, and then D has arrived, so D. So they always give priority to new incoming process, okay, and then there is no other process, so C, and it's trying to give B, but E has arrived, so they give priority to a new incoming process because it never used CPU before, okay, and then D, and then E again, because you are giving 2 time units for each process fairly, right, for this feedback scheduling. Because after they've been serviced, they are placed into lower priority queues, and new process coming into the highest priority queue. Okay, and after all these processes have been serviced 2 time unit, so they go back to C, and 1 time slice, go back to B, and C, and D, and B, C, D, and C runs to completion, and go back to B, and D runs to completion, and B, and so on. Okay, this is multi-level feedback queue with a time quantum of 1 for each priority queue, and this is assigning 2 of I time unit for lower priority queue. Okay, so here is same as before, and new process B has arrived, so they give time quantum of 1. Okay, and then there is no other process. They are trying to give time quantum of 2, but only 1 time unit is remaining. So A runs to completion, and there is a new process coming in C. Okay, and then it's coming back to B, and at this time they are giving 2 instead of 1. Okay, because this is the second round for B. And then D has arrived, so they give priority to D and E. And then it has been assigned 2, and this has been assigned only 1 round, so they give 2 each, and E runs to completion. And then going back to B, because all get 2 rounds of CPU time, and this time it's trying to assign 4, but after 3 it runs to completion, and C runs to completion with extra time unit, and D runs to completion. Okay, And this is for feedback scheduling with time slice equal to 2 of I instead of I 1. Okay. So we have reviewed feedback scheduling, and this is the final scheduling algorithm, which is called fair share scheduling. So here scheduling is decisions are made based on a set of process rather than individual process. So they look at collection of process instead of a single process, single individual process. Okay? The idea is, if you look at the real system, an individual application is usually organized as a set of multiple process or set of threads. From the user point of view, they are interested in how their application performed rather than how a particular process performed. Even though some particular performs faster, the other processes are run slower, then his applications are not running efficiently because they are looking at the collection of process which constitutes a single application. Okay? So in fair share scheduling, they look at groups of process or groups of threads instead of a single process or single thread. And each user is assigned a share of the processor. So each user has assumed that they have an application, and application has a set of process or set of threads, and each user is assigned maybe a fair share of the processor. So we can give, if there are 2 users, we can give 50% CPU time for user A and 50% CPU time to user B. Okay? And the objective of this fair share scaling, is to monitor usage, processor usage, and to give fewer resources to users who have had more than their fair share. So if user A is using CPU for longer time and asking for resource more, then we are trying to give priority to other users which have been using resource in the system less than this user, because this is fair scheduling. So monitor the usage of the CPU and give fewer resources to users who have had more than their fair share and more to those who have had less than their fair share. Okay? Let's look at this example. This is the example of fair share scheduler. So in this example, we have 2 groups. The group 1 has only 1 process. Group 2 has 2 process. And for each group, we assign a fair share weight of 0.5 to group 1 and 0.5 to group 2. And they compute the priority based on base priority. Base priority is they give 60 to each of these process. So 60 is base priority, and lower priority, the lower number means higher priority. Okay, lower number means higher priority. And this CPU J of I is equal to CPU J I minus 1 divided by 2. So this CPU J of I is CPU utilization by process J during interval I. Interval I is equal to CPU utilization of process J during interval I minus 1 divided by 2. And this is group CPU. So they look at CPU utilization of itself, and they look at CPU utilization of group. This is group CPU utilization. So group CPU utilization, this is CPU utilization of group K during interval I is equal to group CPU utilization of group K during interval I minus 1 divided by 2. Okay. So the priority of process I is equal to base priority of process I plus its CPU utilization, process utilization of J divided by 2 plus group CPU utilization of group K, which this process J belongs, divided by 4 times weight of this group K. Okay, this looks complex, but this means you look at base priority plus its CPU utilization and its group CPU utilization. They consider its base priority, its utilization, its group utilization. So in this example, so at the beginning, they haven't used CPU before, so their CPU utilization should be 0, and their group CPU utilization should be 0, and their base priority is all 60. Okay, they choose the first process A, and it's running, and this 60 is the utilization of this interval 0. Interval 0. At interval 1, they compute this priority and their process, the CPU utilization, their group CPU utilization, and so on. So here, their group CPU, their CPU utilization is, so CPU utilization of process A during interval I is half of previous interval utilization. Utilization was 60. So divided by 2. So their CPU utilization is 30 in this interval. Okay. Their group utilization is counted 60. So their group utilization during interval I is half of this previous group utilization. So this is again 30. Okay. Okay. So process A's priority is base priority, which is 60 plus 30 divided by 2, which is 15, plus their group utilization, which is 30 divided by 4, plus weight is 0.5, because they give weight to group 1, 0.5, group 2, 0.5. So this is 4 times 0.5, so this is again 2. So this is also group CPU utilization is also 15. So 60 plus 15 plus 15 should give 90 for this priority. Okay.
I got a question regarding the base priority.
Okay.
Why is it 60?
They give just random number.
Ah, okay.
Okay, for this example. I don't know either. Okay. Anyhow, smaller number means higher priority. Okay. So their priority is increased from 60 to 90, which means they have been assigned lower priority because of their CPU utilization at the previous interval, and which accounts for also group utilization of this group, which has only a single process. Okay. For the other group, they have been used to CPU before, so their CPU utilization should be 0, their group utilization should be 0, and their base priority is 60, so their priority is 60. Okay, so these two had the highest priority. Let's assume that this one gets the CPU. Okay, and this one is also counted 60. This is maybe time slicing, and they every peak they increment the counter that's counting for CPU utilization. So at the end of this second round, at interval 2, they recompute the base priority. So this CPU utilization should be half of this, should be 15. This should be half of this, should be 15. Okay? So 60 plus 15 divided by 2, and they do integer division. So 7. Okay? 15 divided by 2. Integer division 7. So 7 plus 7, 14 plus 60. So it gives 74 to the first process. This one should be 30 and should be 30, and this one is 90. So 60 plus 15 plus 15, this one gives 90. Okay, this one 60 base priority. This hasn't used CPU before, so its CPU utilization should be 0. The previous interval was 0 and this was 0. And group utilization, because this belongs to the same group, this gives you 15. So it will compute, its priority should be 75. So in this case, it selects process A. Okay? So it counts the CPU utilization again, and then 60 plus this is how much? 18, because 37 divided by 2. 37 divided by 2. So this gives you 96. This one is 74. This one is 67 and 0 and 15. So this one gets the priority. So if the CPU is assigned to process C. So the pattern is A, B, A, C, A, B, A, C, and so on. Okay, it alternates, but if this group and this group is having a fair share of CPU, and each process in the group is also sharing the CPU. This is called fair share scheduling. Okay, fair share scheduling. So the motivation is, we are not looking at a single process or single thread. Let's look at a group of process or group of threads, and each application is usually has a set of process, and each application usually is assigned a fair share of the CPU. Okay, that's called fair share scheduling. Okay, so we have reviewed all the detailed scheduling algorithms in this chapter. This is the main topic of this chapter and the next chapter. So we have reviewed first come first serve, round robin, and then what? Shortest process next, shortest remaining time, highest response ratio next, and multi-level feedback queue, and then fair share scheduling. Okay, fair share scheduling. Okay, let's review some of the scheduling algorithms used in the real machine, real systems. Traditional Unix use the following scheduling algorithm. It's used in both system version 5, revision 3, and 4.3 BSD Unix. BSD is Berkeley version of Unix. It's called Berkeley Software Distribution, BSD. Okay. These systems are primarily targeting time-sharing interactive environment, because both of them are developed quite a long time ago. And most of these Unix machines are engineering workstations or servers and used by multiple users in a time-sharing environment. So their scheduling is designed, scheduling algorithms are designed to provide good response time for interactive users while ensuring lower priority background jobs do not starve. So they employ multi-level feedback queue with round robin within each of the priority queue. If a running process does not block or complete within 1 second, it's preempted. So it's using 1 second as a time slice, and they apply round robin algorithm. And priority is based on the process type and execution history. And this is their scheduling formula, which is similar to what you have seen in the fair share scheduler. Their measure of CPU utilization is the the CPU utilization of process J during interval I-1 divided by 2. So they are not looking at the group, but they are looking at previous interval CPU utilization, and they are adding this number to the base priority, and this nice is a user controllable adjustment factor. So actually there, in the Unix system there is a command called nice. Using nice you can control priority. So by having nice you can increase or decrease your process priority. Okay, so this is an example of traditional Unix process scheduling. So it's similar to what we have seen in the fair share scheduler. So this is interval 0, this is interval 1, base priority is 60. There is no nice factor here, so 60 divided by plus 15. So it should give 75 and 60. So it is actually giving A, B, C, and so on, because each process is treated fairly, okay, in this scheduling with round robin. Okay, and you can compute this priority also. So this should be 67 because 60 plus 15 divided by 2. Okay, this one 60 plus 15 7 divided by 2, so 63 and so on. So you can compute this priority based on this formula. And this is the homework. Okay, homework is due by next Tuesday. Okay. Okay, the next chapter, multiprocessor and real-time scheduling. Is this chapter 10 or 9? 10. So this should be typo. Chapter 10. So this is more advanced topic. We can skip, but we can review the content in this chapter. So multiprocessor scheduling and real-time scheduling has some different flavors than uniprocessor scheduling. As an undergraduate student, you need to understand uniprocessor scheduling, but this is some extra materials. Maybe nowadays systems, most of the PCs and servers are multi-core, which means multiprocessors. So to understand modern scheduling algorithm, you need to understand this multi-processor scheduling as well. So let's review this multiprocessor scheduling. So before we discuss multiprocessor scheduling, let's classify multiprocessors. So this classification is a little different from the classification used in the textbook, because I am an expert in this area. I was working on multiprocessor and parallel architecture before. So I classify multiprocessor in this way. So in general, we can divide multiprocessors into two different types: shared memory and distributed memory multiprocessors. But we can classify further because there are some hybrid multiprocessors, or clusters or distributed systems can be considered as multiprocessors in a way. So shared memory multiprocessors are sometimes called tight coupling multiprocessors, and distinct feature of shared memory multiprocessor is processors share a common shared memory, which means it's called shared memory multiprocessor if there are some memory address or memory locations that can be addressed by any of these processors. Okay, then it's called shared memory multiprocessors. So if you most of multi-cores and multiprocessors you are dealing with are these shared memory multiprocessors, because this is easy to program. Other multiprocessors, it's not easy to program. They need explicit parallel program to run on other machines. Okay, so Intel's Core i3, i5, i7 multi-cores, AMD's multi-cores, and Spark's Niagara, Spark, Ultra Spark 1, 2, 3, these multi-cores. Most of these single chip multi-cores belong to shared memory multiprocessors, which means most of the main memory can be referenced by any of the processors or processor cores. And because they can communicate through the memory, because one processor can write to a shared memory and the other processor can read from the shared memory, they can communicate. And these are called shared memory multiprocessors. And these shared memory multiprocessors, they employ each core or each processor, they have caches. So if they access shared memory, then you bring the data or instruction to your local caches. That means each processor core can have duplicate copies of the same memory location. But if some processor writes to a new value to the copy, then the other copies can be stale, which means out of date because it generates a new version, right? Because some processor has just write a new value, which means this is the most up-to-date copy, and all the other cache copies must be deleted because that's the old copy. And to maintain this coherence, they employ cache coherence mechanisms inside each processor core. Usually, these cache coherence mechanism is based on bus architecture, because bus, every processor write or update operation can be snooped or can be seen from other processors by looking at the bus, because bus is a shared communication line, transmission line. If some processor is doing a write, then they can listen. So if they write to some address, if they have the same copy, they have to delete. And this is called write invalidation protocol. And this is sometimes called snooping cache coherence protocol. So they assume shared bus lines, okay, to communicate or to maintain cache coherence. This bus usually has some scalability issues, because bus is a transmission line with multiple loads. Load means they have to drive each processor's pin, right? So the switching is very slow, and that limits its scalability. So all these bus-based shared memory multiprocessors can scale up to maybe 4 or 8 processor cores. So if you're looking at commercial i5 or i7 processors, they are usually dual core or quad core, or maybe 8 core at the maximum. But beyond that, the bus become a bottleneck. Bus is too slow because bus is shared by multiple processor cores. If there are cache misses, cache miss means they have to go to memory, and there are too much traffic, then bus becomes bottleneck. Even though you add more processors, you cannot increase performance. Okay, that's the problem of these shared memory multiprocessors. So to overcome this bus limitation, they sometimes organize this set of processors not using a bus, but using a link, which is a point-to-point interconnect, or maybe other point-to-point interconnect such as mesh or Torus other networks. Link is point-to-point interconnect. One way of connecting multiprocessor is bus is like this. So you have CPU. Inside CPU, you have a cache. And whenever something is doing a write, so bus, you have maybe 64-bit data bus. There are maybe some address bus, and there are other control lines. So read or write. Whenever you're doing a write, you do a write signal generating in this control line. Then every processor is listening to this write control line. If there is a write, and they look at this address, if they have the same cache copy that matches this address, then they have to delete, because somebody has write a new version. That's the cache coherence protocol. But because of this multi-tap transmission line, if you want to drive this electric transmission line, there are multiple loads in this transmission line. So by adding more processor means it's heavy. The switching time will be slower. And the switching time affects the bus bandwidth, because the bus bandwidth, if it's 100 megahertz bus and 64-bit data bus, then the maximum bus bandwidth is 800 megabytes per second, because 100 megahertz times 8 bytes, right? But if you are adding more processors, then there will be more traffic and bus becomes bottleneck. Usually 4 to 8 is the maximum number of cores that you can add to this bus transmission line. Another way of connecting this bus processor is a ring. This is not bus, this is point-to-point transmission line. You directly derive the other processors. Okay? So even though it may take longer, because if you want to communicate with this one, it might take 2 hops instead of single transmission, right? So the latency might be longer, but if you look at this transmission line, because there is only one road in this transmission, you can switch much faster, so the bandwidth is much higher. So eventually this can sustain more number of processor cores. Okay? So this is called ring, and this is called torus. Torus is like this. Torus, not torus, this is mesh. So this is processor core, and they can communicate with this processor by sending a packet to this message to this processor. So it's multi-hop communication, but each transmission line is a point-to-point transmission line. Usually point-to-point transmission line is much faster than bus speed. Okay, so this is used for LAN bus. LAN bus. LAN bus is another DRAM technology from California, USA, and they have some patent, and their speed is usually much faster than DRAM because of this point-to-point transmission line and packet-based interface. And if you use this kind of mesh, this will give you higher bandwidth because there are multiple parallel transmissions are possible. And if you apply ring to each of these, this is called torus, and this is two-dimensional torus. And you can apply three-dimensional torus. And this kind of interconnection network is applied to supercomputers. So in Intel's, what's the name? Intel's supercomputer called Paragon or teraflops, they connect 64K Pentium Pro using three-dimensional torus, and they can achieve maybe teraflop performance about 15 years ago. Okay, using Pentium Pro, 65,536 organized as three-dimensional torus.
Okay. Is it possible to connect commercial motherboards and build a supercomputer at home?
Maybe you can connect commercial CPUs, not commercial motherboards, because nowadays most of the CPUs are single chip. And single chip inside you have multi-core already. So you can connect multi-core CPUs together and build supercomputers. And so the examples are these distributed memory multiprocessors. Okay, so if you connect processors in this way, it can scale up to, as I said, 64K processors. But for cache coherence in this scale is very difficult. So instead of shared memory multiprocessors, they build distributed memory multiprocessors, which means they have their local memory, and memory is not shared. Memories are private memory. And if they want to communicate, they have to send messages like networks. Okay, So you can send message, but message sending and receive is much faster than distributed systems like internet, because these are hardwired interconnection networks, and they have much higher bandwidth. And these are called discrete memory multiprocessors, which means each processor has its own private memory, and memory is not shared. So it's called multi-computer. It's not multi-processor, multi-computer. And sometimes from academia, they announce they build supercomputers from their lab, and they should be these discrete memory multiprocessors or multi-computers because it's easy to build in terms of hardware, but it's harder to program because you have to send messages and receive messages. You need explicit message passing programs, and it's called MPI, or there are different programming perspectives. So many of the supercomputers are built using this discrete memory multiprocessor because it can scale up to one number of processors. Okay, Intel's teraflop machine is also discrete memory multiprocessors, and commercial multi-cores are usually shared memory multiprocessors. But Intel also built experimental many-core CPU chip that has, I don't remember exactly, but about 1,000 processor cores in a single chip. But that's actually distributed memory multi-cores in a single chip. So it's multi-cores and many-cores, but it's distributed memory chip. So if you see multi-core with many number of processors, then you can expect those to be distributed memory multiprocessors. Okay, that means they can scale to more number of processors, so their peak performance is much higher, but their programming is much more difficult because it requires explicit parallel programming. Okay, and this is called distributed memory. You have questions, so.
Yes, I had a question. With respect to the buses, is there no way in which you can... No. If you have two buses, is it possible?
Two buses?
Yeah, like have in the same processor architecture to kind of overcome the limitation of the 8 processors. Can you have like one bus for 8 processors and then...
Another factor is the pin count. You have to consider the packaging. You can have 2 buses. Actually, in Pentium 3 or Pentium 4 systems, there are 2 buses. One is called front-side bus that connects to system bus and to the main memory. The other is called backside bus that connects to second-level caches, which has much higher and wider bus bandwidth.
Okay, so it is possible.
It's possible, but if you have 2 buses, that means you need more number of pins to this packaging, which means increasing number of pins means packaging is much more expensive. So CPU becomes more and more expensive. Okay? So in general, we can classify multi-core, multiprocessors into shared memory and distributed memory. And most of the systems are shared memory multiprocessors. So all the multi-cores or servers you are looking at are shared memory multiprocessors. Okay? Supercomputers or experimental machines are distributed memory multi-core. Hybrid multiprocessor. This is used for smartphones or PlayStation 3 or the game machines. They have this kind of architecture. In this hybrid multiprocessor, there are some one or more master general purpose processor, and there are multiple slave coprocessors such as DSP or graphic processors. So I don't remember exactly, but this iPhone or this Galaxy, it has A5 chip, right? It has its quad-core CPU. There should be general purpose ARM CPU, 32-bit ARM processors. But they also have some DSP, and they might have some other processors, maybe customized ASIC for DMD or other multimedia processing. And Sony PlayStation 3, they have this master processor, which is a PowerPC, and they have 8 co-processors that can do graphic processing, and it's called SPP or something like that. I don't remember if it's spontaneous parallel processor or something like that. That's optimized for graphic processing. The master processor can handle maybe operating system and maybe some kernel functions or key functions, and the other processors are usually processing for graphics or for DSP. It depends on the application it's running. Okay, for PlayStation or this game machines, maybe graphic is the main function. For these, DSP might handle some other.
Yeah, I read somewhere the university who connected a lot of PlayStation 3s and built a supercomputer in their university.
That's the U.S. military.
It's possible.
Maybe
It's a new supercomputer for the U.S. military.
U.S. military?
Yeah.
Okay.
They apparently it's cheaper just to buy PS3s, buy the single processor and just hook them up all together.
That's right, that's right. Actually, these PlayStation 3, its core processors are 128-bit processors. So they can do 128-bit computation in every cycle. And 128-bit, they can also divide 128-bit to, they can do 2 64-bit computation in parallel, or 4 32-bit computation in parallel, and so on. Because multimedia or graphic processing has this small quantity of data, and they can do SIMD style parallel processing, single instruction, multiple data stream processing. Okay, the MMX instructions used by Intel processors are all this kind of SIMD processing. Okay, so if you have small 16-bit data or 32-bit data, instead of just single 64-bit computation, you can do 2 32-bit computation in parallel or 4 16-bit computation in parallel, and they can speed up this multimedia data processing. And these are called hybrid multiprocessors.
SoC is a hybrid multiprocessor.
SoC means system on chip, so it includes most of them are this case, but SoC can include I/O peripheral circuits and main master processor with some special co-processor and so on, on a single chip. Okay, so system on chip, which means processors, co-processors, I/O peripherals, sometimes memory. Okay, sometimes not, because memory is usually bigger, so you need option memory. But system on chip means they can integrate all these functions in a single chip. Okay. And if we extend further, these clusters. Cluster means called. This research started from UC Berkeley, and they first called it network of workstation, and nowadays they call it clusters. So workstations are connected through the local area network with high-speed local area network, and it can function as much as these shared memory multiprocessors, but they have a higher network overhead because of it through the network, not because with this customized interconnection network. But with clusters, and so clusters of workstation or network of workstation is another. You can view them as a set of processors or distributed systems through the internet. It also can be viewed as a set of workstations. So there are some research can do. Network is becoming faster and faster. So ignoring network cost, you can view all these lots of machines scattered all around the world as a multiprocessors available, and you can exploit this
There is an initiative for that. It's called the World Community Grid.
Yeah, it's also called grid computing. Yes.
No. There is a specific one which is for like medical research, I think, something like that.
There are many initiatives going in from different application area.
Yeah, which is for like you download the little packages and your computer does everything on the background because it's not really that.
That's right. The programming used for this discrete memory multiprocessor can be used for network workstation or clusters or grid computing, as you said. Okay, because they can apply the same programming. The only difference is the network latency will be much higher, but it's becoming smaller and smaller, and they can utilize these parallel systems. Okay. Okay, let's look at the other issue, granularity. So, in the text we said synchronization granularity, but sometimes it's called granularity of parallelism. So this is called fine-grained parallelism, medium-grained parallelism, coarse-grained parallelism, or independent parallelism. Fine-grained parallelism means they need fine-grained parallelism about less than 20 instructions can be processed. But you can view this as a task that can be assigned to a single CPU. But this task is small, less than 20 instructions. And in this group, in this task, they need synchronization or they have dependency between these tasks. So after their execution, they have to wait for another task for synchronization, or they have to receive some data. Okay, and these are called fine-grained parallelism. Usually, this parallelism is inherent in a single instruction stream. Okay, medium-grained parallelism is about 20 to 200 instructions. This is parallel processing or multitasking within a single application. So this is somewhat larger task than this fine-grained task. Coarse-grained, the size is about 200 to 2000. This is useful for multiprocessing or concurrent process in a multi-programming environment, and very coarse-grained is 2000 to 1 million instruction. You can, if you have this much parallelism, then you can do distributed processing across the network. So, if you want to exploit this much fine-grained or medium-grained parallelism, maybe you need shared memory multiprocessors in a tightly coupled environment. Right? But if you have this much very coarse-grained parallelism, maybe you can exploit this parallelism in a distributed environment as well. Okay? And independent parallelism means each task is independent. It can be assigned freely to any other processors. So you can view it as, this is more abstract view, but people use this terminology quite often. Okay, so instead of this one in the computer architecture, we use instruction level parallelism, which is more like fine-grained parallelism. It's actually a little finer. And we have thread level parallelism, and we have actually we can have two instruction level parallelism or thread level parallelism. Instruction level parallelism is employed in superscalar processors. So superscalar processor, did I explain before? I think when I explained 486 Pentium 4, I explained a little bit. So 486 is a single issue processor, which means every cycle it fetch or decode a single instruction. It processes one instruction at a time. Pentium is dual issue processor. Every cycle it can fetch two instructions, it can execute two instructions, it can complete two instructions. It's called dual issue, superscalar. Pentium 3, Pentium 4 is triple issue, superscalar processor. So in Pentium 3 or Pentium 4, every cycle it can fetch, decode, and execute 3 instructions every cycle. And Core i5 or i7 processors are using Core 2 architecture, microarchitecture. Core 2, Core i7 processors are, each core is quad-core, quad-issue superscalar processor. So it can fetch or decode 4 instructions at a time, or it can complete 4 instructions at a time. i-Tanium processor, which I was involved in the design, it's 6-issue superscalar. It can fetch, decode, execute, complete 6 instructions every cycle. These are called the instruction level parallelism. Instead of processing 1 instruction at a time, it can process, it can fetch 6 instructions, it can decode 6 instructions, it can execute 6 instructions by dispatching 2 different execution pipelines. Those are instruction level parallelism. Okay? At the instruction level, instead of fetching single instruction, it can fetch 6 instructions at a time. Usually, which is another fine grain, but usually instruction level parallelism is limited to 6. 6 issue is the maximum issue processor available commercially. Okay. Thread level parallelism is close to this medium grain parallelism in this textbook. Thread level parallelism in i7 processor or Pentium 4, they can apply multi-threading, which means nowadays commercial Intel processors have 2 program counters. So at every cycle, it can execute instructions from 2 applications every cycle in parallel, not concurrently as in operating system. It has 2 program counters, and it can fetch and execute 2 instructions at a time. And Sun's UltraSPARC 3 processors are 8-core, 8-threaded multi-core chips. So these UltraSPARC processors, each chip has 8 cores, 8 processor cores. Each core is 8-way multi-threading, which means every cycle there are 64 program counters. So you can, in these processors, every cycle it can execute 64 applications in parallel, not concurrently, in parallel. It can fetch 64 different applications in parallel and execute. It's called thread level parallelism, and these threads are independent threads. So they are actually independent threads. Okay, these are hardware threads, not operating system threads. Okay, so there are some terminology. So you can, there is no exact definition of fine grain or medium grain or whatsoever. So you just view these are the common terminology used in parallel processing area. Okay. Okay, so I gave you background for multiprocessors. We can move to multiprocess scheduling next week.